So, Harvey, can you explain to us the four freedoms?
Yeah. Okay. So, um, in 1941, the United States had not entered the war, but FDR was seriously concerned about the likelihood that that we would be attacked. And for what it's worth, they knew, though they did not expect it to come from Japan in
Hmm.
the course of that year so readily, they expected actually a threat from Germany. And the reason I say that is they had, for however they had secured them, there were indications that Germany had gone into North Africa not merely to secure the oil available in North Africa to run their military machine, but they actually had a plan. They were going to drive south, and then the idea was to either get an alignment with or come across in Brazil. This is not a fantasy at all. This is what was on the plans. And in any case, they were funneling money into Mexico in hopes of buying off political people and others with the idea of sort of subversion from the South. This is exactly what. So, anyhow, in 1941, as the year began, FDR was concerned about sustaining Britain and its ability to itself to withstand the Blitzkrieg. So he proposed at the end of 1940, just after he won re-election, an election to a fourth term as president, he proposed a Lend-Lease Act that we would turn the United States into the arsenal of democracy so that Britain and some other countries would be able to withstand Nazi Germany. In January, at the State of the Union message, he had decided not only to talk about the threat of an attack and the idea of the arsenal of democracy, he was also determined to tell Americans that if we went on a war footing, it would not necessarily mean an end to the reforms that were pursued in the 30s, known as the New Deal. And in fact, he said that it was imperative, if the United States was to be able to fight in the war, if or withstand an attack, that Americans needed to be in better shape, which meant that all Americans should have certain kinds of needs met. And he then, late in the speech, said that Americans should begin to imagine a world ahead, a post-war world characterized by four fundamental human freedoms: freedom of speech and expression, freedom of worship. Both of those are essentially in the Bill of Rights that are part of the Constitution. But then he went on and argued, or not argued, he promised the pursuit of freedom from want, which was very much at the heart of the New Deal, and freedom from fear. And I'll just point out that people listening, even those who are gaining the least from what we would call capitalist America, saw themselves at a moment where they could aspire to secure equal rights. And what I mean by that is North and South African Americans who heard the speech on radio believed that when they said freedom from one, this applied to poor whites as well, believed that that was a promise that in the near future, the United States would seriously address the inequalities and the needs of all Americans. But the other thing was freedom from fear. They heard as a promise that soon enough, the United States and the government would do something about Jim Crow laws in the South, apartheid, which we might call it,
Hmm.
and Jewish Americans in the North who had been attacked by right-wing neo-fascist mobs would be more secure on the streets of Boston in particular. So so that speech itself resonated, and it became eventually the theme or the sort of the ethos of why we were fighting in World War II. The comic itself makes solid reference to that particular speech because it lays the groundwork for the speech that he made 3 years later in 1944 at that January State of the Union message. It became known as the Economic Bill of Rights speech. And that was a speech in which he actually lays out a vision of the United States adding more rights to the Constitution, which would include very basic material rights such as health care, guarantees of education, the food, clothing, and shelter kinds of things. In other words, decent housing. And the reason that he went from the For Freedom speech, the visionary speech, to that is the fact that they did polling between 41 and 44, actually, especially in 43. And the polls showed that the overwhelming majority of Americans wanted a more social democratic America. That is, for example, 85% of Americans in these polls said they wanted universal health care, guaranteed health care for all Americans. They said they wanted free public education as far as one's abilities could take one. They wanted decent, comfortable housing. And this empowered FDR to make that speech, and by no means to have it projected out of his own mind and aspirations, but rather to reflect and articulate the aspirations of, again, the overwhelming majority of Americans. I don't know if I said before, 85% of Americans wanted universal health care. 85%. It was 95% of Democrats and 75% of Republicans. So basically, when Americans entered the war, it was to save the United States, not having already saved it from the Depression, to save it from fascist attack from the Nazis and the German imperial forces. But it was also the case that Americans believed that they were fighting for the ability to take the United States in a more social democratic direction after the war. So that's the Four Freedoms, and to set the stage.
Harvey, I've got a two-part question for you, my friend.
Okay.
How were Americans in such a position to kind of push for social democratic changes, considering what Wilson enabled as president, the very draconian laws towards the end of the war, in the First World War, that honestly led to Eugene Debs being imprisoned,
right,
for nonsense.
Right.
And the second part is, how were Americans willing to, and let's face it, you had some coming of age people. Let's say your average draftee is 18 to 20. We're going into 1940. They're in their 40s. They're kind of like the power block there. What led to the sea change, in their opinion, to lean into that social democracy, considering that Wilson kind of did an end around and locked things down and was, his laws were far more draconian.
Of course, Wilson. We're talking 1914 to 1918, World War I. Actually, he was elected in 1912, so president 1913 to 1921, I guess, would have been right into that new year. Anyhow, so in the 1920s, capital ruled in America. Okay, number one. Number two, immigration was all but eliminated in this country, except, by the way, from Mexico, where Mexicans could come in because landowners, the plantation owners in Texas and the Southwest and California, they wanted that labor. They were allowed in. There was no limit on Latin American migration into the United States during those years. But the other thing is this, that labor was pretty much crushed during the 20s. However, when FDR ran for office in 1932, when his first run for the president, he had told people that given the depression that had begun in the late 1920s and was wrecking the American economy and destroying American lives, that he thought it was time for the United States to go radical for at least one, fairly radical is what he said, for at least one generation. And he laid out in the campaign of 32 a New Deal, okay, which was to include everything from old age pensions, meaning Social Security, unheard of before in the United States. It was going to secure jobs for Americans. They were going to build houses. They were going to improve the environment. I mean, it was a mass, if you like, array of programs that were implied in that campaign. And that's exactly what they did. And in the course of the 1930s, this is critical because your question is really important. How was it that they could imagine doing it? What empowered them to do it? Well, for a start, during the 30s, there was enacted by FDR and the Democratic-controlled Congress, the National Labor Relations Act. And that guaranteed, well, what it is, it set up the National Labor Relations Board and guaranteed workers the right to organize unions. And in the course of those years, new unions were formed and older unions expanded. Millions, and I'm not exaggerating, millions of workers organized and joined labor unions. Now, that gave FDR an organized base, not just people who wanted to vote for him, but an organized base. And to take this further, in 1936, when he was running for his second term of office, he said something in his acceptance speech at the Democratic Convention. This is great. This actually is my other truly favorite speech. Actually, I've got a lot of favorite speeches, but in this one, he says, he actually points his finger at the forces that are trying to undo his administration. Capitalists organized to try to bring down his presidency. They organized something called the American Liberty League. But working people were so committed to the New Deal and FDR that they didn't at all buy into it. So there was no grassroots base for this very elite organization, American Liberty League. But FDR then could turn around and point a finger, and he did so regularly. He called them the economic royalists. They were like the political royalists of the who would have blocked the revolution in '76. He said they're economic royalists. And he said, moreover, he said, they complain that we want to overthrow American institutions. Well, there is something we do want to overthrow. We want to overthrow their power. He actually calls on Americans to see his presidency as not simply a rescue operation for the economy, but moreover, an empowerment of working people, which is what it became. And finally, he basically aspired to bring an end to the overbearing power of the long persistent Gilded Age power structure of what he called the corporate titans and the economic royalists. And he won the most incredible majority of votes in 1936, and the Democrats controlled Congress. The only thing that kept them from doing everything that FDR truly wanted, which is when Social Security was enacted in 1935, they left out agricultural workers and household workers because the Congress was controlled by the Democrats, but the long-standing chairs of the committees were Southern Democrats, white supremacists.
Mm-hmm.
And they did not want household workers and agricultural workers to have Social Security, or for that matter, union rights. So both the Social Security Act and the National Labor Relations Act did not empower household workers and agricultural workers. It also helped the California landowners because it meant that the very diverse agricultural workers out in California, Mexican and Filipino, and what were known as Okies, the folks from Oklahoma who were driven off their lands by capitalists and a Dust Bowl, when they got out to California, they would often get the shit beat out of them when they were trying to organize. If you ever get a chance, I know it's a big book, read The Grapes of Wrath, or at least see the movie, The Grapes of Wrath. It'll reveal to you exactly what you need to know about that. Well, the point was, FDR, for all of his faults and failings, for all of the faults and failings of that generation, was in many ways a radical president, and the American people at that time were empowered and pursued radical transformations. They literally rebuilt the American infrastructure. They literally improved the American landscape. They rescued the Plain States from the Dust Bowl by planting millions and millions of trees to block the winds that were driving the topsoil across the Midwest to the east as dust, aka the Dust Bowl. So that's for a start. They organized these labor unions. They created women's organizations to supervise, or in some ways police, the big corporations to try to hold down prices. They enacted Social Security. They enacted, as I said, the National Labor Relations Act. They organized in the New Deal a massive program of music, arts, theater that operated not only in the big cities with shows and other things, but went across the country with traveling shows. I mean, it was an incredible transformation in America. It was in some ways a revolutionary period. And so going into World War II, they were ready. Oh, not to mention, You've got the fact that you had the Civilian Conservation Corps, in
Mhm.
which 2 million young American men and boys fought soil erosion and other environmental disasters. These are the folks who themselves then were drafted or enlisted, went into the factories of World War II. There was an understanding that the government would make sure that workers would be organized in unions during World War II, on the condition that the unions themselves did not call strikes during the wartime period. There were wildcat strikes, but they only lasted usually like a day, and that was just a way of giving the finger to the bosses and saying, there's only so much you can get out of us. So anyhow, that's how it worked, that they were empowered by their own labors, their own organizing, and the laws that FDR and the Democrats did actually pass. Does that